Hey everybody, so today we are going to learn about community ecology. So a couple vocab words just so you make sure that you know what we're talking about. So communities are defined based on their species composition or their diversity. So a community is a bunch of populations that are interacting with each other and living in a certain habitat. And the habitat is where an organism lives, so that includes the vegetation and the species that are living in there. Species diversity is the number of species in a community and also how many individuals per species. So, for example, a forest community might consist of elk, deer, and foxes, but there are 10 elk, 11 deer, and 2 foxes. And then species composition is the actual identity of those species. So, Cervus canadensis is the name for an elk. Okay, so there's some ways that we can measure the diversity and make a calculation so we can compare different communities. So this is called the Simpson Diversity Index, and this is in your equation sheet. So this takes into account the number of species and also how abundant they are. And the number is going to be from 0 to 1, and the higher the number means the more diverse the community, meaning there's more different types of species and not just one or two that have a large number. So if you take this equation, remember that this sigma is the sum. Little n is the total number of organisms of a particular species, and n is the total number of organisms of all species. So if you look over here at this example, right, species 1, which is the green box, has 3 of those individuals, and then the total number of organisms is 15 if you counted up all this. And then you square that, and that's 0.04. And then you do that for species 2 and species 3, and then this sigma, remember, is sum, and so you add them all together. And then don't forget the last part where you subtract that from 1. So 0.063 would be your answer. And if you were to compare that to a community that had zero point 0.8, right? The community that has zero point 0.8 would be more diverse and have more uh, different species. Okay, so another vocab, a niche. A niche you may have heard from regular biology or honors bio, but that is an organism's activities, it's a relationships, it's who it mates with, it's who it eats and who eats it. And basically I think of it as its job in the ecosystem. So, for example, there's what's called a fundamental niche and a realized niche. And I think that this is a really great visual. So the fundamental niche is where it could live. So given the habitat and the food and the resources, this is where the species could live. However, because of competition, because of territoriality, um, this is where it actually lives. So that is the realized niche. So species can interact between each other, between species and within. So interactions between species would be interspecies interactions. So that would be like maybe the deer and the elk competing for the grass, right? Interactions within a species is intra. So make sure you know that inter is between, like intercellular means between cells. Intracellular means within a cell. And so an example of this within a species might be 2 bucks of elk competing for a mate. So there are some other ways that organisms can interact, and these should be familiar from biology. So mutualism is where both species have a positive outcome. So here's an example of what's called a tangarana tree. I took this when we went to Peru with some students, and our guide was telling us that there are fire ants that live in this tree. And so whenever an animal comes over to gnaw on it, the fire ants will go out and attack it. So the ants are getting a place to live and food, and then the tree is getting protection. So that's why they both benefit. Yucca plants and yucca moss also have a mutualistic relationship. Yucca moss are the only insects that pollinate the yucca plant, and the young live within it. So that's again positive for both. Another really cool interaction is between leafcutter ants, fungus, and bacteria. I didn't take this picture, but I did take these, and so you can see that the leafcutter ants make this path, huge numbers of them just going through the forest, and they're so strong. So they're carrying these leaves, and what they do is they carry these leaves back to where they live, to their nest. They have antibacterial chemicals on them, and so they grow a fungus. So the leafcutter ants can't eat the leaves. They give the leaves to the fungus, and the fungus breaks them down into a food that the ants can actually eat. And then the ants have an antibacterial chemical on their feet, and so that the fungus won't get um, infected with bacteria. So the fungus are getting food, right? The leaves, and then the ants are eating the fungus, and then the bacteria, the ants are helping the fungus so that it doesn't get taken over by bacteria. Pretty cool. All right, another mutualism. Again, I took this picture, cute little sloth, and this is like a little heating pad, and this is what's called a cecropia tree. And so what happens is these Aztec ants live in the cecropia tree, and they create a chemical that when a sloth or some other herbivore tries to eat the cecropia tree, it gums up. It makes this chemical that makes it so its mouth parts can't work properly. And so the cecropia tree and the ants are kind of similar to that tangerana tree. So commensalism is where one benefits and the other one is neutral. So an example of this would be the monarch butterflies and milkweed. So the larvae grow inside the milkweed and they take up a toxin in the milkweed that's harmful to vertebrates. And so then the adult monarchs are going to be bad tasting to birds, which is one of their predators, because of the toxin. So it's not hurting or helping the milkweed that the larvae are there and extracting that toxin, because they can still produce enough for them. But it is helping the adult butterflies so they don't get eaten by birds as much. So that's why it's a plus and then a neutral. So obviously predation is another, and parasitism is those are both positive and negative. So this is a picture of a lynx and a snowshoe hare. And so of course this one is the predator and this is the prey. And the other is a parasite, and that could be like a tapeworm, right? Because a tapeworm inside of an organism is ingesting nutrients, and so it's taking those nutrients away from the host. Same thing with the mosquito. When it bites you, it's actually taking your blood, and so those nutrients, it's a positive thing for the mosquitoes and negative for who it's biting. This is a picture of number of pelts taken way back when it was still okay. And I want you to pause the video and I want you to figure out, this is the lynx and the snowshoe hare. So which one is which? What is the black line and what is the dotted blue line? So go ahead and pause the video. Okay, so if you said that the dark black line was the prey or the snowshoe hare, and the blue line is the lynx, then you are correct. So a couple things to notice is that the prey population is always larger than the predator population, right? If it was backwards, then that predator population would collapse. So you need to have more prey because as the energy gets transferred up, there's less of it. And so that's why predators have fewer individuals in their populations. There's also a lag time, a predator-prey lag time. So as the predator goes up, right here, the prey is going to go down. But then as the predator goes down, the number of prey are going to increase. And then as the predator goes up, the prey go down, and so it's a little lag between when the populations are peaking. Another way that organisms interact to get energy is called resource partitioning or niche resource partitioning. And here's an example of root systems of three different species of plants. And so what they're doing is they're looking for water, right? So this one is really good at catching water up near the surface. This one is kind of a medium depth. And then this one is really good at catching water down below. So they are competing and they may have slightly different niches. So this one is a deep soil water catcher versus this one is a surface. And so they can survive in the same habitat with using the resources in a slightly different way. All right, coevolution is when two or more species evolve together because of selection pressures on each other. And so an example, I think it's easiest to think of an example, is snail shells, right? Over time, they've gotten thicker, and their predators, the crabs that eat them, their claws have gotten more and more thick to be able to break their shells. So the shells get thicker, the predator claws get stronger, and then so on and so forth. Also, poisonous salamanders, right? The predators get immune to the salamander poisoning, and so then the salamanders become even more toxic, and then the predators become even more immune to it. This is one of my favorites. This cowbird is just fascinating, so smart. And it's what's called a social parasite. And so what they do is the cowbird lays its egg in a host nest, right? And that mom who's feeding her babies can't tell the difference between the cowbird and then her own eggs and babies. And what happens is the cowbird is really dominant and pushy, and so he or she can push the other birds out of the nest, and also that cowbird can get in front of them and get all the food, and get all the attention of the mom. So the parents of the cowbird, right, just leave their baby, and that's their way of being kind of a social parasite, is that they take the nutrients from the babies, but not directly. So pretty cool. Okay, so the diversity of an ecosystem is related to the changes in it. So organisms in an ecosystem that have low biodiversity, so for example, polar bears, right? They live in an ecosystem with pretty low biodiversity, then they're going to have issues if one of those species changes its population size, right? It's going to affect all the other trophic levels. If there is higher biodiversity, then if one species or population goes down, other ones will be there to fill and compensate for it. So high biodiversity, very stable ecosystem, low biodiversity, unstable ecosystem. So if you are a scientist and you're trying to stabilize, let's say, the polar bear population, then you could add biodiversity to it. All right, so abiotic factors and biotic factors can help maintain ecosystem biodiversity. So abiotic factors would be like, again, nothing, it's not living. So water, climate, sunlight. Biotic factors are things that are living, so like producers. If a population has lots of producers, then they're going to have a lot of food and a lot of biodiversity. And then also dominant predators can keep other prey populations down so they don't take over. So keystone species versus a dominant species. We'll watch a little video on these wolves, but keystone species are not very abundant in a community, but the structure of that community depends on them. So they're not very abundant or common, but they do so many things that changes all the different trophic levels. So an example would be the wolves in Yellowstone. And we'll watch a video on this. But the wolves eat the prey, the elk, and cause the elk to move and migrate, which changes the vegetation, which then changes the streams, and it's really interesting. African elephants are also keystone species, so again, there's not very many of them compared to other populations in the ecosystem, but their tusks, when they're digging, can make watering holes for other organisms. Their dung is habitat for insects, and when they eat, they change the landscape of the ecosystem. Exotic species, I'm sure you've all heard of, are species that are not native to a certain area, right? And that can be either introduced and be intentional or unintentional. They can hitch a ride on a boat and come over to another area. Now, and so that's kind of the big umbrella term. So exotic species and then invasive species are specifically ones that harm the community they're introduced into and harm um, those native species. I'm sorry. The reason why invasive species populations grow and they often take over is because they have no natural predators or disease, right? They came from a different area with different predators and different diseases. So in their new habitat, they don't have a natural predator and they don't have any diseases that keep their population size down. They also are often better competitors for the resources, and so they're able to outcompete the native species. They also, a lot of them reproduce really quickly, and so they would be kind of like the R selected species we talked about before, and they would be able to reproduce really fast. So an example of that would be Asian carp. The carp are in the waterways in the United States, and they're pushing out a lot of the native fish. And then also the kudzu, which we'll watch a little video about, and that is a plant, a vine plant that's kind of taking over. All right, so succession, we're just briefly going to go over this, is a predictable change in how a community will change over time. So primary succession is when you begin from rock. So here is a picture of primary succession, and that would happen like when there is a volcano eruption or the glaciers, right? When the glaciers recede, you're left with rock. And so you start with rock, and then what happens is you have a pioneer species, and that pioneer species is the first to colonize that first habitat. And so in terms of primary succession, lichens are often the pioneer species, and this is a picture of lichen. And what lichen do is they colonize the rock and they break it down with chemicals and over long periods of time into soil. And then as soon as it's soil and that those conditions improve, then other things like grasses and weeds and bushes and trees and everything can grow. So primary succession begins from rock, and that would be like volcanoes or the um, glaciers, and then secondary succession would be when it's from soil. So that would be like clear cutting a farm or trees or forest, or a fire would be secondary succession, or a flood, anything that leaves the soil. And that would be an example over here. So primary succession is going to take a lot longer because you have to break down the rock and turn into soil for the other organisms to colonize. The pioneer species in secondary succession would be something like weeds or grass, the first things that start growing on a hillside that's had a forest fire. And then the climax community is the community that will be stable if the environment stays unchanged. Okay, so that could be, this is a picture of Alaska when we took some students there. So the climax community in the tundra, right, is going to be small plants and small bushes, right? It can't sustain. It's above tree line. It can't sustain because water and wind and all the other things it can't sustain with trees. So the climax community is different depending on where it is. So here, the climax community is small plants. Whereas in a different place in Alaska, here's some of the students that went, you have what's called a temperate rainforest because you've got lots of water and you've got less wind and it's not as high in elevation. If you think of our climax community outside in um, Colorado up here, we have a montane forest. However, if you go to the Midwest, their climax community is plains because and grasses because of the the different abiotic conditions. And then if you go to somewhere like Africa or the Sahara Desert, then you have a different climax community. So I just a lot of people always think that it's going to turn into a forest. It's not always going to turn into a forest if the resources aren't there. So that's it. Thanks for listening.